Is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Sean Jones NBA show. I'm recording this on Thursday evening, April 16th, but probably will not be out until Friday. But the playoffs are basically here. We've had some really awesome play-in games so far this week, with Portland beating Phoenix, Charlotte winning a thriller against Miami. And then last night, the Clippers lost to the Warriors and the Sixers beat the Magic. We still have yet to find out who the 8 seeds will be. That'll be played Friday night. But the purpose of today, I'm going to do my playoff previews and predictions. And so we'll make some assumptions about the 8 seed, talk about all the teams still alive. But with that said, let's go ahead and get right into it. So I'm going to go through each series and talk a little bit about the matchups, and then we'll make predictions for all of them. And then at the very end, I'll do my formal full playoff predictions. Won't get into full detail on the later series, as we'll talk through those as the playoffs go on. But going to start in the West, just because the West is typically a little stronger, so often get some better series there. And I do think some of the better series are in the West in the first round this year as well. So going to start off just with the 1 seed and go down. So the Oklahoma City Thunder will play either the Phoenix Suns or the Golden State Warriors, depending on who wins Friday night in that game to clinch the 8 seed. The Thunder have been, a juggernaut once again. They are 7th in offensive rating this season, 1st in defensive rating for the second year in a row, 1st in net rating for the second year in a row with a plus 11.1. Not quite as dominant as their 12.8 they had last year, and they did win 4 less games, 64 this year as opposed to 68 last year. But, I think it's safe to say that they were equally as good, if not better in some ways, just because they've had some other guys step up who weren't really part of the rotation last year. And look, we know how good OKC is. I don't need to get into too much detail here. SGA has just been absolutely spectacular once again. He is clearly the MVP, in my opinion, even though Jokic and Wemby have put up some really, really insane seasons as well. But Shea's the only guard in NBA history to shoot 55+% and score 20+ points per game in the same season. And he's well above that mark at 31 points per game. I mean, there's only been 2 other guards to even hit 55% and score double-digit points per game among guys that have shot 1-3 per game, just because, obviously the less jump shots you shoot, the easier it is to shoot high percentages. But the other 2 guys who did it were, just role players. So to see him do that at an MVP level as one of the best players in the world, he's making a real case for himself as maybe the best player in the world. I don't know if I'd quite go there yet, but regardless, he is the head of the snake, the engine that makes OKC go, particularly offensively. And he's also just been ridiculous in the clutch this season. He's 1st in the NBA in clutch points, 1st in clutch field goals made, 1st in clutch plus minus on the year. He's got a 3-to-1 assist to turnover ratio in those situations. And even though he's got the most points, he's got 25 plus less minutes than everybody else in the top 5. So he's been efficient when he is there as well. And it's been kind of a weird year for the Thunder. J-Dub has missed 49 games. Hartenstein's missed 35 games. So they've been pretty injury riddled this year, but Cason Wallace has taken a big step up this season, particularly on the defensive end, but I think he's shown he's capable of doing a little bit more offensively than they've sort of let him. And I think if he were on another team, he'd probably be averaging 15 to 20 points a game, but he's sticking in his role on this team to do what they need to do to win. AJ Mitchell's been a huge breakout guy for them this year, kind of came out of nowhere a little bit, but looks like a legitimate, at the very least, 1st guard off the bench, 3rd guard in the rotation. I think he could probably start for a lot of teams as well. That's just, you could say that about a lot of guys on the team. But Jared McCain's been, resurgent since coming over there. He kind of struggled with the Sixers earlier this year, but has been a nice little change of pace, much needed shooting. And so I would be surprised if he's not an X factor in at least a couple games for them during the playoffs this season. And then Chet has elevated his game a bit. I don't think he's still turned into that reliable number 2 option or anything like that offensively, but he's so good defensively, and he's improved in little areas across the board offensively to the point where he's probably going to make All NBA this season. Did make an All-Star game as well. And, it doesn't really matter who this team plays between the Suns and the Warriors because they're going to win this series, and they're probably going to do it very, very convincingly. To put it into context, they have only lost 32 games over the last 2 seasons, and the Suns and Warriors both lost more than that just this year. And if it is the Suns who are favored in the game and were the higher seed and had a much better record than the Warriors did this year, they have wildly overperformed this year. They end the season 15th in net rating at plus 1.5. They were a top 10 defense this year when a lot of people thought they would really struggle in that area. But transparently, they just have not been the same team down the second half of the season. They started the year 30-19. They've gone 15-18 since, if you include the play-in game. At that point, they were 10th in net rating with a plus 2.8. They're 18th since with a minus 0.9. They were top 5 in defensive rating at that point with a 111.8. They've since slipped to 15th down the second half of the season at 114.5. So their defense has been their identity most of the season. Their offense has been hit and miss. They shoot a lot of threes. When they don't go in, they don't win a lot of games. They don't generate a ton of creation outside of Booker. Jalen Green's missed a huge chunk of the season. Dylan Brooks missed a lot of times. So they have struggled at times on that end of the court. But defense has been their identity, and Jordan Ott has really instilled that in this team. But the defense just has not been the same. They went from one of the best in the league to middle of the pack, and they don't have an offense good enough to be able to win games with an average defense. And a lot of that has to do also with their clutch play for their struggles. Since January 31st, they are 29th in the NBA in clutch net rating at minus 32.7. Only the Jazz are worse, and it's been really bad offensively. They have an 85 offensive rating in those situations. And Booker has been the main culprit. He's only shooting 30% in the clutch over that span. He has more turnovers than assists. And he just has left a little bit to be desired this season. It doesn't feel like sometimes he has the same sort of advantage creation, like in the play-in game against Portland. Toumani Camara just locked him up. Denny Avdia got whatever he wanted, even though the whole team knew exactly what he was going to do. And you couldn't say the same for Booker. And they don't have enough around him to take the pressure off of. So I'm not going to totally blame him just because they're asking him to do a lot. It's either that or Jalen Green probably is going to have to be a little too involved. Same for Dylan Brooks. Those are 2 guys that I think you want within a certain role, but not beyond that. And they're kind of being asked to be beyond that. So the Suns don't stand a chance against the Thunder. They're also way too small. They're playing guys like Jordan Goodwin and Royce O'Neal, who are 6'4" at power forward a lot of the time. They've kind of moved away from Mark Williams a little bit down the stretch of the season. Oso Ighodaro has played more minutes than him on average since Mark came back from his injury. And Oso is very undersized and just not a prototypical rim protector or anything like that. And so I think they're going to get really, really overwhelmed physically just because of all the defenders OKC can throw at Booker in particular and the rest of the perimeter guys who already are not very efficient players in Green and Brooks. And like I said, the size is going to come back to bite them too because the OKC has options down there. And I don't know the Suns, again, they're just they overachieved this year. And I do not believe that they are the same team that they were earlier in the year, just based on what we've seen. They've kind of just lost some of that mojo they had early on. And so without that, I just, not only do I think that they have no chance to win the series, I honestly would be surprised if they win a game. If it's the Warriors, I feel pretty similarly. They're kind of drawing dead. They're only 20th in net rating on the season. They were outside the top 15 in both offensive and defensive rating. And it really is a story of injuries for them this year. Jimmy Butler tore his ACL on January 19th. At that point, they were 25-19. They were 8th in net rating with a plus 3.5. Since then, they've gone 12-26. They're at the 21st net rating with a minus 4.5. So a drastic 8-point swing there in net rating. They went from a solidly above 500 team to playing at lottery level pace. They finished the year with only 37 wins. I know a lot of that has to do with the fact that Steph also was hurt, but they weren't very good before Steph got hurt. when Jimmy was out as well. And he's kind of been the complete game changer for them. We saw this last season when they were hovering around 500 and just not a very good basketball team. And then when they traded for Jimmy, completely turned their season around. So I know his stats aren't always super flashy, but the impact he's had on this team is, the stats do not lie. There's so much better on both offense and defense, what he can do as a defender out on the perimeter next to Draymond as sort of a just back line there. And then also offensively, what he does as a passer, as a guy that gets to the free throw line, generates points in the paint. Like, they just don't have a lot of guys that can replicate what he does. And that's why he was such a big addition for them. And so with him out, I just think Oklahoma City, similarly to Phoenix, is just, they're small, they're really old, like they have guys that are injury prone, and outside of Steph, I just don't trust anybody on this team. And I think they're going to have a ton of bodies to throw at Steph. Dort, Caruso, Wallace, like it's going to be, if Steph plays 40 minutes, it's going to be 40 minutes of just hellish defense on the perimeter against him. And so I don't know. I just do not think they have the juice without Jimmy. If he was playing, I think maybe this becomes more interesting, assuming they have like a healthy Porzingis, a healthy Horford. But those guys also have just not been very reliable. And the Warriors just haven't been a very good basketball team in the second half of the season. And I think everybody knows that. I mean, Steve Kerr's been pretty candid saying that this team is just, they are what they are. And we'll see. He's almost outwardly said the dynasty's over. So I think OKC is going to sweep whichever one of these teams ends up making it to the 8 seed, just because of the massive talent discrepancy, the massive, physical advantage, and the fact that, they have one of the two best players in the world and a really good supporting cast and deep group of guys around him. Up next, we've got the Spurs against the Blazers. The Blazers knocked off the Suns earlier this week in rather dramatic fashion. They had a pretty big lead that they built up in the first half and were shooting the lights off the ball, then went absolutely ice cold in the third quarter. Suns were able to claw back a little bit. Suns ended up going up double digits in that fourth quarter, but Portland stormed back late. Went back to what I was saying earlier about Phoenix's crunch time has just not been very good recently. But Portland finds themselves in a spot they probably didn't expect to be, now in the 7 seed, and they not only made the playoffs, but avoided OKC in the first round. And they've been inconsistent this year. They're only 19th in net rating. They started the year 12 and 19, and then were 23 and 28 at one point, but then they're 10 and 4 in their last 14. So, in that 19 and 12 span, they're a +3 net rating. So they've played a lot better as of late. And then on the Spurs side, they have been a absolute juggernaut. I think a lot of people thought they could make the playoffs this year. I picked them to make it, but I don't think I foresaw this sort of ascension coming. Even though I'm super high on Wemby, I think even the most optimistic Wembanyama prognosticators didn't think that they were going to necessarily win 62 games. But here we are, in year 3, and the Spurs are already like legitimate contenders at this point. So they were 4th in offensive rating, 3rd in defensive rating, 2nd in net rating with a +8.3. And during the second half, they were arguably the most dominant team in the NBA. I mean, they started 32 and 16. They finished 30 and 4. They were a +13.2 net in that span. That was first in the NBA. They were the first best offensive team with 122.2 offensive rating. They were 3rd defensively, and they were 2-2 in that span when Wemby did not play. So that means they were 28-2 in the last 30 games that Wembanyama has played, which is just ridiculous. And you can feel his presence out there. So, down the second half of the season, they were basically unbeatable when he did play. And this was just a tremendously successful year for the Spurs. Obviously, Wemby is ridiculous. He took a big leap this year, efficiency wise. I think a lot of that has to do with just general decision making offensively. His turnovers were way down, but for me, it's the shot profile that really helped level him up. He took 3.3 less threes per game this season compared to last season, which is something that I harped on through most of last year to say, like, dude, you're an absolute giant. You're an alien. Like, leverage that, use it, go into the paint more often. And he's shooting more mid-range shots as well, but he's pretty efficient there in general. The 3-point shot, he can make it, but It's not like he's making it at some super impressive clip. I think he was around 35% this year. But that kind of change in mindset for him to cut down on the jump shots has done wonders for him offensively to just be a more efficient player there. And then he is the best defensive player in the NBA by a large, large margin. He should absolutely unanimously, by a landslide, win Defensive Player of the Year this year. And it's not even just the blocks, it's the versatility to guard out on the perimeter and move his feet and stick with smaller guys. It is the general deterrence at the rim. It's that those stats won't show up, but the guys that are going through the normal motions offensively in their game and driving to the basket and having second thoughts, a shot they might normally take, they're deciding to not take it and dribble back out because they are terrified of what Wemby can do and knowing that they probably are going to get their shot blocked. And so he's just so good on that end. But it hasn't just been him. Stephon Castle's taken a significant leap for them this season, going from sort of an inconsistent role guy to, there's a real case that he was the second best player on the team this year and could have, arguably been an all-star based on how he played down the second half of the season. I don't know if his numbers were quite there at the point of the all-star break. There's some buzz of some people in the media voting him for all-NBA. I think he's going to make an all-defensive team. But the shot has come a long way for him as well. De'Aaron Fox continues to just be the steady veteran for this team in the backcourt. Dylan Harper looks like going to be a future stud. I think he's someone that if he was on a bad team could have easily averaged 18 to 20 points per game, 6-7 assists. But, he's in a winning environment and playing within his role, so probably going to play dividends for him down the road. Anyway, Keldon Johnson had an absolute career year from an efficiency and an impact standpoint. I think that he is in prime position to potentially win Sixth Man of the Year. I think he would be my vote just because of the, just clear impact you could feel for him on this team. And then Julian Champagnie is kind of the secret sauce for this team, if you will, offensively specifically, just because of what he brings as a shooter. They've got a lot of so-so shooters on this team, but he's like the best, most consistent one there. But they're a plus 8 points better when he's on the court compared to when he's off. And offensively, they have 120.4 offensive rating, which is 4.2 better than when he's on the court. So when he's out there with Wemby, with some of those other guards, they are one of, if not the best offense in the NBA. And so I do have my concerns about the Spurs, throughout the playoffs as they go on in terms of their inexperience. Most of their guys haven't been there before. Even their quote unquote veteran in De'Aaron Fox has made one postseason appearance in his entire career, and he has 0 series wins in his entire career. Harrison Barnes is really the only one, or Luke Cornett, if you want to throw him in there, that have significant postseason experience. But Cornett's been a career backup and wasn't really getting huge minutes for the Celtics in the postseason. And then Harrison Barnes is kind of fallen out of the rotation. And, it's been quite a while since he's been an impact player on an actual contending team. So I do have questions about how that experience might catch up to them down the road. And, things like Wemby and can he endure a full playoff run 3-4 rounds? He played under 30 minutes per game this year. He only played 35 plus minutes in non-overtime games 9 times this year. He didn't hit the 40-minute mark once. Normally once we get to this point in the season, you want to see those guys start to get up there in minutes a little bit more. And they're a plus 15.2 points better when he's on the court than when he's off. And their defense kind of falls off a cliff when he is not out there. It's well below average compared to, one of the best in the league when he's out there. So if he's not playing big minutes, or if he, he's been banged up as of late, that could be a concern as well. And then, their guards, they kind of all have shaky jump shots. De'Aaron Fox shot 33% from 3 this year. Castle shot 33%. Harper shot 34%. So if those numbers hover around those numbers, then I think it's, teams are probably going to leave those guys open more often than not and live with it. But for the purpose of this matchup, I don't think Portland has a ton of a chance. I think any of those concerns that come up is a round 2 issue. I think for the Blazers, they have a fun bunch. Denny has just been awesome this season. Klingon has really come into his own, and he's shooting threes now and been an absolute menace as a rim protector and defender for this team. Drew Holiday still steady as a rock and kind of beaten the washed allegations at this point. Toumani Camara, I already talked about him when I talked about the Suns. Just absolutely locked up Devin Booker. I think he's going to be one of those guys that's just made for the postseason setting with his 3-and-D skill set. Scoot's played a lot better as of late. He's kind of an X factor for them, and he was really good defensively against Phoenix in the play-in game as well. Jeremy Grant, Shaden Sharp, Rob Williams. I still like Pete Krejci as well. So they've got some guys. But the thing is, this team does struggle offensively at times, and they're really, really reliant on Denny Avdia and mostly his downhill attacking and driving and getting into the paint. We just saw in the playing game, like, everybody in the arena knew he was going to try to drive to the basket during crunch time, and he had no problem doing so. And not only did he get to the basket, he made the shot and he got fouled. And that was the story of that game, is that Phoenix just could not contain him doing that. But the thing is, the Spurs are probably the hardest team in the NBA to get to the basket on because of Wemby's gravity and what he can do in the paint. So I do question, is Denny going to be hesitant to drive in against Wemby? And then if he's not hesitant, is he going to be effective because of what he can do as a rim protector for the Spurs? And so if he's not driving to the basket, are they going to be able to generate efficient offense? Because this is not a very good three-point shooting team. They're 28th in the NBA in three-point percentage, only 34%. We saw how cold they can get, like, in the second half against Phoenix. And so, a lot of their offense comes from Denny getting to the free throw line. He was second in the NBA in free throw attempts per game behind only Luka, third in free throw attempts in the total league behind only SGA and Luka, third in free throws made per game behind SGA and Luka. He was third in free throw rate among guys with 1,000+ minutes behind only Zion and Rudy Gobert. And so, like, his bread and butter was either getting to the basket and scoring or getting to the free throw line as a result of his downhill attacking. And so I just think it's kind of breaks as a pretty bad matchup for Portland, just because it's basically the best rim protecting team in the NBA against a team that strongly relies on getting downhill to the basket. And so if they don't hit threes at an abnormal rate, I think it's going to be really hard for them to compete in the half court offensively. So I do think the Spurs, despite some of my experience concerns with them, should cruise pretty easily in this one. And so I do have San Antonio winning this series in 5 games. I do think there could be some competitive games in there because I think Portland is going to play super hard. They're really solid defensively when they're engaged as well and healthy. And so I do think they could cause a little bit of issues for the Spurs, especially when with Klingon, having a decent size comparison to Wemby. So they've got size there as well. They've got perimeter guys that can, be a handful for the guards for San Antonio. But ultimately, I just don't think Portland's going to be able to score enough. And so I got Spurs in 5. Up next, we've got the Nuggets against the Timberwolves. And these teams have both kind of had inconsistent years, to say the least. This is now the 3rd time they're meeting in 4 postseasons. Back in 2023, when the Nuggets won the NBA title, they beat Minnesota in the first round in 5 games. Then the following year, in 2024, Nuggets were big favorites to win the West, and by a lot of accounts, the favorites to win the whole thing. And they played the Wolves in the second round, and the Wolves took them down in 7 games in a Game 7 on Denver's home court. That was kind of Ants coming out party. They get to the conference finals before losing to Luka and the Mavs. And so here we are, round 3, the tiebreaker of sorts. And like I mentioned, these teams have both kind of had inconsistent years. So on the Nuggets front, they started the season 20-6 and then went on a 22-22 stretch during the middle part of the season before finishing the year on a 12-game win streak. So, overall, they're 7th in net rating with a plus 5.2. They are 1st in offensive rating with a 122.6, which is the 2nd best offensive rating in NBA history. Just a ridiculous number. Not really surprising given Jokic and some of the upgrades they made in certain spots in the offseason. But they went more than half of a season playing 500 basketball. 3 months of this year, they were a 500 team. They were only a plus 1.1 net rating in that span. But I will say, they were very banged up. They had some key injuries during that stretch. During the 12-0 stretch that they had a plus 0.7 net rating. And a lot of this comes back to Aaron Gordon. I know Jokic missed some time, but he ended up still playing enough games to qualify for the awards. But Aaron Gordon has been sort of the X factor for this team and really one of the most important players from like a glue guy role player perspective across the NBA. And they were 27-9 when he played and only 27-19 when he didn't. And they're 11.5 points better when he's on the court. So I do kind of feel like a lot of that 500 ball can be, tied back to the fact that they didn't have Gordon for large stretches of that. They didn't have Jokic for stretches of that as well. And so when this team's been, fully intact like they were to start the year and to finish the year, that's a 32-6 stretch that they had to, if you take out the 22-22 in the middle, probably a little unfair to do that completely. But on the Wolves side of things, they were 12th in offense, 8th in defense, 10th in net rating with plus 3.3, which isn't bad. But you look at the last couple of years and their conference finals teams, and, they were 4th in net rating last year, 3rd the year before that. So they certainly did slip a little bit. And it kind of felt like every time they looked poised to make a little bit of a run, they would lose kind of a stupid game or lose a couple in a row that maybe they shouldn't have. And then every time you feel like you're going to be out on them, then they would kind of turn things back on. So they've been just really inconsistent all year. I mean, they still got up to 49 wins. So that's nothing to be ashamed of, but it just feels like they never really got into a groove. It was kind of like a 3 steps forward, 2 steps back type situation. We're still making progress, but never quite felt like the peak Wolves that we've seen over the last couple years. And so for this matchup, on the Nuggets side, we know what Jokic is going to bring. He led the league in assists. He led the league in rebounds. He had a ridiculous 57% from the field, 38% from three on 28 points per game. His advanced stats feel fake, honestly, every time you look at them. But the question is this the team that, started 20-6 and finished 12-0, or the team that went 22-22 over the middle part of the season? And they had kind of a weird year, as I've said. Cam Johnson was a bit underwhelming to start the year, but you do look at his stats down at the end of the season, 43% from three. It's hard to complain about that. They were 8 points better with him on the court compared to him off. And they did have a lot of injuries, as I mentioned. Peyton Watson, who had a legitimate breakout season, he missed 28 games right when he was starting to hit his stride. Gordon missed 46 games. Jokic missed 17 games, which isn't a huge number, but he's been really durable. And so him missing over 15 games is a big deal for this team. And one of the weird things for the Nuggets this year is they were bad in the clutch for the first time in a really long time. They were a minus 3.2 net rating, which is 17th in the league. In the clutch this year. And you look at just the past couple of years. Last year, they were a plus 17 in the clutch, which was 3rd in the NBA. 2024, they were a plus 24.5, which was 1st in the NBA. Then 2023, they were a plus 10.4, which was 3rd in the NBA. So, some of those struggles, you did feel that when you were watching the games. And I think during that middling stretch they had, it was a lot of games, stupid games that they kind of blew, or, games that were used to the Nuggets winning, they just didn't. And that's while getting a far and away career year out of Jamal Murray, who's going to make all NBA this season, and deservingly so. Bumped his stats up across the board, bumped his efficiency up, looked like the peak playoff Jamal Murray we've seen in the past, but he did it and sustained it over an 82 game season. So that was crazy impressive on his part. We knew it was in there. He just hadn't put it all together. As I mentioned, Peyton Watson had very much a breakout year this season, and there's already rumors of them, salary dumping Cam Johnson to be able to pay Peyton Watson. That's how good he was this season. And aside from that, there are real concerns for Denver's defense too. They're 21st in defensive rating this year. To be fair, they were 22nd last year, and they still nearly beat the Thunder. They were 15th the year they won the championship, but they elevated that to 3rd in the playoffs. So at least we have seen them be able to kind of put things together come playoff time and perform a little better, even though they haven't had great defensive numbers over the years. And so there was a while where it felt like maybe this just isn't Denver's year. During that stretch where they were struggling, like the injuries were just piling up. The clutch stuff was weird. Like it just felt like they were losing games that they should win. But they do finally seem to be fully healthy at this point. And a 12-game winning streak going into the postseason is no joke. And they beat some good teams over that stretch, including the Spurs multiple times. But for the Wolves, I think the biggest question for them obviously is going to be Ant's health status. He did play a couple games down the stretch coming back. They went 6-5 without him to end the year, but he did not look good when he did come back. He only averaged 16 points per game in 3 games that he returned, shooting 41% from the field, 29% from three. I'm not going to put much stock into that because those were late season games and they were already kind of locked into the 6th seed. So, there's probably just some rust there. But there are other concerns beside that for the Wolves this season. Their defense, when Gobert is off the court, absolutely falls off a cliff in a way that it hasn't really in years past. I already mentioned that their ratings across the board are a little bit lower than they've been in previous seasons, but they were 12 points worse defensively with Gobert out of the game. When he's on the court, they have 109 defensive rating, which would put them second in the NBA over a full season. And when he's off the court, they have 121 defensive rating, which would put them 28th in the league. So Gobert being on the court or on the bench is the difference between this being, an elite defensive team or an absolutely porous defense that is among the bottom feeders in the NBA. And so that's kind of a problem because Gobert has had inconsistencies in terms of staying on the court come postseason time. And so if they do take him out, what does this defense look like? I mean, there's a chance it really, really is a struggle for them when he's not out there, which if you're relying that heavily on Gobert, then, the Wolves are also a much worse offensive team statistically when Gobert is on the court. So it's kind of a give and take and what they want to prioritize there. But against Denver, with how good they are offensively, I don't know how much they can afford to, have him out of the game. So I do think Gobert is probably going to have to play a big role in this. And then you look at a guy like Julius Randle, who, started off the season really hot, was kind of inconsistent down the stretch of the year. We've seen him be one of the worst postseason performers in the league when he was with the Knicks, but he was phenomenal last year. He was a huge reason they made it to the conference finals. He completely outplayed LeBron and the Lakers in the first round last season and was a big reason for why they were able to pretty much dominate LA in that series. But the biggest question for me with the Wolves, when they took Denver down a couple years ago, the way they were able to do it was with their size, and they had sort of the twin tower look with Karl Anthony Towns and Gobert. And their strategy was to put Cat on Jokic and have him guard him one-on-one, and then have Rudy Gobert as sort of the roamer, cheating off of Aaron Gordon in the dunker spot to be the weak side rim protector. But I don't know if they have that luxury now because I do not know if Randall can guard Jokic for a full series. Actually, I take that back. I do know, and he can't. It's not like Cat really could, but at least just with his size, he could, be a big body out there and handle some of the strength there. But Randall is a good amount smaller than Towns, and so I don't know if I would trust him to, run that same sort of look. So they might need to just put Rudy Gobert on Jokic, but I worry that then he's going to pull him away from the rim. They're going to lose some of their defensive effectiveness with him not really protecting the rim. And Gobert's kind of not been a great option on Jokic over the years too. So with all that said, I do think Minnesota certainly has a chance here just because we've seen them beat this team in the past. And this has been a very back and forth sort of quote unquote rivalry between these teams. But I actually kind of feel like Denver is going to win this, I won't say easily, but I don't think it's going to be as competitive a series as we've seen between these teams in the past, because I do think the double big look is really the thing that helped them beat them previously. And I also just think Denver is hitting their stride at the right time. This might be the healthiest that we've had Gordon, Murray, and Jokic all year. Cam Johnson is playing his best basketball of the season. The bench unit, it might be the best that they've ever had in the Jokic era between Peyton Watson. Tim Hardaway Jr. has shot the ball really well for them. Bruce Brown returning to the team has been just a reliable, steady ball handler off the bench. And then they at least have an option in Jonas Valanciunas, even though he's fallen out of the rotation a little bit. But, he's a better option than DeAndre Jordan or whatever they've had in years past. So they go legit 9 deep. They have options for the 10th spot if they want to as well. And I know I talked about their defensive concerns, but we've seen them turn it up in the postseason in the past, and I don't know. I just think this Denver team on paper is, up there with any team in the league. And I think the Wolves have just more question marks than year past. Like, even if Ant is only 85, 90%, that's pretty close to where he can be. But he's been a playoff riser. Like, another reason why the Wolves beat the Nuggets in years past is because he's been, arguably on par with Jokic in terms of performance and been played like a legitimate MVP candidate in these series. And so if he's even slightly compromised and he's playing just at a normal regular season Ant standard, then that might not be enough for them. And if they get anything but the good version of Julius Randle, I don't like their chances either. Their bench is gotten thinner over the years. They don't have Nickeil Alexander-Walker anymore. Ayo Dosunmu has been a very good pickup. But look, they're 8 through 10 is Kyle Anderson, Mike Conley, and Bones Highland. None of those guys are instilling confidence in me. So Anderson can, be somewhat effective defensively, but he's a 0 on offense. Conley has just become a completely inefficient player on kind of both ends of the court at this point, even though he's a good decision maker. And then, Bones Highland in a postseason rotation, consider me not confident in that one. So I'm actually going to take Denver in 5. I know that sounds a little shocking, but I just think that there's enough things that could go wrong for Minnesota where this actually might not be as competitive as people think, even though on paper it might be the best series in the first round. But I'm also just high on Denver, and I think that they're, still capable of making a deep run. And I think they're kind of clicking at the right time. Up next, we've got the Lakers versus the Rockets in the 4-5 matchup. And, obviously this series would look a lot different if not for injuries. But, all we can do is hope that Luka and Austin Reeves come back at some point during this series to, give the Lakers a chance here. But for LA, they had a kind of a weird year where the record was a lot better than their net rating would suggest, which people were skeptical of them earlier in the year because that was the case. And they did kind of hit a rough patch during the middle of the season, but they had a 16-2 stretch late in the season before these injuries happened where they were a plus 10.2 net rating. Their only 2 losses in that span were Detroit and Denver. They finished 9th on offensive rating on the season, 19th in defense. But over that 18-game stretch, Luka was absolutely playing out of his mind, putting himself in the MVP conversation, averaged 37 points per game. And so the question is going to be, can Luka play? Or can Reeves play? Can even just one of them play? Because this year, they're 43-21 when Luka plays. They're only 10-8 without him. They're 36-15 when Reeves plays. They are 17-14 without him. They're 6-6 when neither of those guys play. So tiny sample, I will say that. But the Rockets also do not instill much confidence in me at this point. A lot of the stats are good for them. 8th in offensive rating, 6th in defensive rating, 6th in net rating with plus 5.4. They did finish the year 9-1 after starting 43-29. But I've kind of been out on the Rockets all year, to be honest. Preseason, I was a little lower on them than a lot of people after the Fred VanVleet injury. I thought that was pretty significant of an injury. You throw the Steven Adams injury in there, and he's kind of the secret sauce for this team. They're 8 points better when he's on the court. Their defense falls all the way to 14th, so right around league average when he's off the court. So that's the reality of the team now. So, they're a lot worse defensively when he's not a part of this rotation. And look, there are just a lot of underlying issues with this team that I'm not a fan of. Their clutch play has been really, really not good this year. They're minus 8.8 net rating in the clutch. That's 24th in the NBA. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Ime Udoka has zero creativity in the half-court offense. They're 19th in offensive half-court offense, but that includes the fact that they're the number 1 offensive rebounding team in the league. When they get an offensive rebound, they're only 27th in terms of scoring after that, which is, again, half-court offense. So, their half-court offense has been pretty ugly through large portions of the season, and they are one of the lowest assist teams And a lot of that has to do with just, they don't have a lot of shooting. I know they got up to a really hot start from deep, but you look down this rotation. Amen Thompson, 22% from three. Şengün, 31% from three. Dorian Finney-Smith has been absolute disaster. This signing, 27% from three. Tari Eason, you look, okay, 36%, not too bad, but he was red hot to start the season. He's 22% from three since the All-Star break, so he's been abysmal. Josh Okogie's had a surprising 39% from three this season, but his playoff career 3-point percentage is 18%. And that's not like a zero sample size because he was starting games for Phoenix a couple years back. So, his body of work of his career would say that that's sort of a false number at 39%. Jabari Smith, 36%. That's fine, but that's nothing more than league average. I don't think defenses are, scrambling to get out to cover Jabari Smith when the ball rotates to him. Reed Sheppard is probably the only real reliable shooter at 39% outside of Kevin Durant, obviously, who's 41 this year. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's a lot of Kevin Durant down the stretch. And I've talked about this on other podcasts about Kevin Durant is still a phenomenal player, top 15 guy in the league, just truly unguardable offensive player in terms of just his shot making ability. But he's past the point of his career where he's bending the defense. Defenses don't need to react to him the same way they do a Luka or a Jokic or an SGA. Because one, he's not a huge threat as a passer. I mean, he's not a bad passer, but he's looking for a shot. And also just his shot profile, like he wants to get to difficult mid-range shots, which if you're a defense, you're comfortable living with that. He's going to make it more than the average player. But again, you can't really guard that shot anyway. And especially in a postseason setting, like you're going to trade twos for threes all day and lower percentage twos than if he's getting to the basket. So Kevin Durant, again, I'm not trying to knock him. He's 37 years old, still spectacular at what he's doing, but I just don't think he is an offensive engine at this point of his career. He's a great individual scorer, but I don't think he's, moving needles offensively. And a lot of the half court numbers back that up. And it's a lot of him having to bring the ball up. And I worry about that in the postseason where he's going to get, more full court pressure, and he's a good ball handler, but he is turnover prone when he gets blitzed. And so I have my concerns about that. And then outside of Kevin Durant, who do you trust with the ball in their hands in the half court? Şengün obviously is a good player, but he's been inconsistent this year. He's not the most efficient player, especially for a guy primarily working out of the post. Amen Thompson, I've kind of been the leader of the let's pump the brakes charge on Amen just because he's spectacular defensively, but offensively, I still just don't know what he is. I don't think he's a primary ball handler. He, can't be a super successful off-ball guy because of how abysmal he is as a shooter. So he's got to rely on being a cutter, downhill attacker. But, how much of that becomes easier to guard come postseason time, especially once you start playing against some of the better teams. And then Ime Udoka just doesn't trust Reed Sheppard. And I wish they would just live or die by him at this point. But, he had 14 games this year under 20 minutes, only 22 games above 30 minutes. So, he's been kind of sitting in that 25-minute range, 26 minutes per game on the season. So where did the other 22 minutes come from as a ball handler? Is it Durant? Are you asking Thompson to do that? Is Şengün running point center at times? Of course, you can rotate in Aaron Holiday, but I don't think he's a legitimate postseason player, to be honest with you. And so, yeah, I think that a lot of this can be overcome when you've got a guy like Steven Adams who's rebounding at an absurd rate and helping with the defense. But, without him on the team, I just feel like they've lost a little bit too much to injury, especially when you look at how much of a failure the Finney-Smith signing has been. And I don't trust the team offensively. I don't trust them to, generate good looks down the stretch of games other than please, Kevin Durant, bail us out, which again, that's going to work sometimes. But, history tells us, Kevin Durant has not won a postseason series since 2021. And I'm not doing the whole, you can't win with Kevin Durant thing. I'm just saying if he's your lead guy, there hasn't been a blueprint for that being super successful over the past few years. But I say all of that to say that, if Luka and Reeves don't play, I don't think the Lakers have much of a chance here because LeBron is probably going to get his stats, but similarly to KD, he's a guy that is, his stats are a little emptier than they used to be, or a lot emptier than they used to be. Would it shock me if he averaged 38-8? Like, no. But I don't know if that's going to be enough. They're losing 25 points from Austin Reeves. They're losing over 30 points from Luka. Like, where are those 55 to 60 points coming from? Like DeAndre Ayton is I'm not going to trust him especially in a postseason setting until he puts together, weeks of consistent play, which I do not think he's capable of. Rui Hachimura, again, decent role player, but like if he's your number 2 option, that's kind of a disaster. Marcus Smart, he's just more of a defensive guy throughout his whole career, but especially at this point of his career. Luke Kennard can make shots, but I don't know. He's been such a liability defensively in the postseason for his previous teams, so they might kind of eat him alive there, but they might have to play him. Like Jake LaRavia, like it's a really sad list of number 2 options next to LeBron. And I just think even if he gets his stats, I don't know how this team's going to score enough or do enough offensively to compete. Especially, I knocked on the Rockets a lot, but the one thing I don't have doubts about them is their defense. They are really solid there. And I do think that, especially against this supporting cast with the Lakers, like they should be able to, really clamp down on them. And so even though I don't feel good about the Rockets, I honestly intended to pick against the Rockets regardless of who they played. If they played the Wolves, the Nuggets, the Lakers, if they were healthy, like I would have picked all of those teams over Houston. But I just can't in good faith pick this Lakers team to win a postseason series. Unfortunately, maybe they win a game and it's 3-1 and then Luka comes back for game 5 or something like that. But there was a report today that I think that they're both going to miss the whole first round. So, I just don't see it happening, sadly. So I've got Rockets in 5. I do think there'll be probably competitive games because I think the Rockets are just going to do stupid stuff on offense and probably let the Lakers hang around a little bit. But ultimately, like I don't think the Lakers have enough in the tank without Luka or Reeves. If just one of those guys was playing, I actually think I would pick the Lakers, especially if it was Luka. Luka alone, I think would, even if there was no LeBron, no Reeves, I'd probably pick Luka in the Lakers. But if it was Reeves and LeBron, I'd probably pick the Lakers. But I don't know. It's just going to be too much for them, I think. And so I'm going Rockets in 5. Wouldn't be surprised if it went to 6, but yeah, I just think it's going to be quite the uphill battle for them. Okay, moving over to the East now. We've got the Pistons who will play either the Magic or the Hornets in the first round. The winner of Orlando and Charlotte will be the 8th seed. That game will be on Friday as well. And the Pistons had quite the year. They were 10th in offensive rating, 2nd in defensive rating, 3rd in net rating with a plus 8.2. A lot of people thought they might be due for regression. I think probably my biggest miss this season was the Pistons. I thought that they would be a play-in team and kind of fall back a little bit compared to ascend, and that was obviously very incorrect. Kate took another leap up. A lot of the role guys, particularly Jalen Duren, took a big step. Asar Thompson's been, spectacular, especially defensively. Tobias Harris continues to be steady. They replaced some of the shooting with, guys like Duncan Robinson. They brought in Karis LeVert, like Isaiah Stewart, been great for them defensively, especially. Ron Holland's still in the mix. Like they've got some guys. Dennis Jenkins has been sort of the unsung hero for them because when Cade was out, he kind of stepped in seamlessly and provided the offensive creation that this team needed. So the Pistons they've been the best team in the East all season long. They've been a undisputed top 3 team in the NBA all season long. They earned that number 1 seed, winning 60 games, even with some injuries. So obviously they're in a good spot and, playing as the 1 seed is where you want to be. I still do have some concerns with Detroit across the board. I feel a little similarly to how I feel to the Spurs, where, there are some question marks for me about, experience and if that's going to come back to bite them. Cade was so good this season, but he was really not good in the postseason last year. He really struggled from outside shooting, and the Knicks kind of dared him to shoot. and just his efficiency across the board wasn't great. He was very, very turnover prone. And, I'm not going to blame him entirely. It was his first postseason, and they were asking him to do a lot. But the thing is, I feel like they're still kind of going to be asking him to do a lot this year. Like, I don't know if they added enough around him where I'm sitting here like, oh, yeah, like a lot of the responsibilities off Cade now. Jalen Duren, as I mentioned, having a great year, but it just his general playing style, he's not a dump it down on the low post and go get us a bucket kind of guy. He's not a guy that can generate offense from the top of the key or 3-point line or anything like that. So a lot of his touches and points are going to come via Cade still, and he's going to have to, generate looks for Duren and get him looks in his spots. And so, is that good enough as a number 2 option? I think only time will tell. I'm skeptical of that. I think late in these games, people are also kind of hesitant to go to big men in those kind of situations, unless you've got like a Jokic or Embiid type that can really create their own look or, play make for others, which I wouldn't put Duren in that category quite yet. And so next to Cade it might might be Tobias Harris as the guy who's going to have to take on some of that responsibility. And, he just has not been a trustworthy guy come postseason time over the span of his career, especially when he's been relied on in that kind of role. So, it could go one of two ways. If Cade is absolutely dominant and sort of overcomes some of the things he struggled with in the postseason last year and continues to be as good as he had through this regular season, then yeah, I mean, I think that the Pistons should feel good that they can, at the bare minimum, get to the conference finals. But I still think some of those things need to play out, and we'll see how they look. But again, similarly to the Spurs, like I don't think that's going to be a big issue for them in this series, just because of the nature of their opponents. Like if you just look, if it's the Magic, then I don't. They are just an ugly basketball team right now. They don't seem very connected as a group. Their offense is not fun to watch. They, don't shoot the ball particularly well. They take bad shots. They turn over a lot. Paolo Banchero has regressed to a point that is just kind of unfathomable, to be honest. Like I've been such a Paolo fan and defender over the years that even I have to sit back and look in the mirror and be like, man, was I just wrong about this guy? Like I know what I've seen out of him. I've seen him in the postseason look like the best player on the court at times. I've seen him elevate his game in the playoffs on, overmatched teams where he's at a huge talent disadvantage, at being asked to do a ton. And so that's one of the reasons that I've kind of held out hope for him, is that in the biggest moments, like in the postseason, like he's been his best and he's been the guy for Orlando. But that playing game, he certainly was not that guy in that game. So we'll see. They obviously have to win this game for him to even get to that point. But he looks just disengaged. He looks like he doesn't care that much. He looks like he is sick of Jamal Mosley. And so I don't know what's going to happen with him or, his dynamic with this team. Franz also hasn't exactly played super well in big moments for this team. We've seen him struggle in the postseason in the past, and he was also not very good in that playing game. Bane has been pretty solid for them. Suggs been in and out of the lineup. He shot the ball terribly in the playing game. And then, the bench is not exactly the best. After Anthony Black, Patadze can give some spot minutes, but you got Kane coming in, and he's, in my opinion, kind of barely a rotation player. And I don't know where the offense comes from for this team. I just think it's not their year. Sometimes it's just ugly, and you gotta just accept the fact that something's gonna have to change in the offseason. I think Mosley's as good as gone at this point, unless they go on some miraculous run where they make the conference finals or something like that. But I don't see that happening. And maybe that's what they need. Their offense is just so uncreative that the sets, they're so basic, and they're allowing Paolo to have these bad habits. And so I do think they just need a new voice. And at this point, I would probably be kind of surprised if Orlando even won on Friday night, even though they have the talent to do so. And I was super high on them coming into the year. That was another huge miss for me. But yeah, I just don't see it with this group there, because even their identity, which has been their defense, is way down this year. They were number 2 in defense last year, number 2 in defense the year before that. They're 11th this year. Their offense is marginally better, but not good enough. I mean, only 19th in the league, where the 11th best defense is not going to get it done for, actually being a competitive, consistent winning team. So I think the Magic are probably cooked, if we're being totally honest, just based on the vibes. But I think talent-wise, they got a lot, and if the vibes weren't so bad, I think they would have a chance against Detroit. But I just can't say that right now. And then if it's Charlotte, the Hornets are kind of the other way around. Like the vibes are immaculate with the Hornets right now. They're finished the year 5th in offensive rating, 12th in defensive rating, which is surprising for this team given the personnel, but then also just historically what they've been over the past few years. They finished 8th in net rating with a plus 5.0. They started the season 16-28. They had a flat net rating, which is 16th in the league at the time, but they finished the year 28-10, 29-10 now if you include the playing game, and they are 2nd in net rating in the entire NBA over that span with a plus 10.4. So that is a 39 game sample. That's essentially half the season where they were not just a solid playoff team. They were not just pretty good. They were dominant. Plus 10 double-digit net rating is ridiculous. And to be 2nd in the league over that span, when you've got Detroit, San Antonio, and OKC, 3 teams that won 60-plus games this year, especially San Antonio and OKC that look like juggernauts out there in the West. So over that span, they were up to 6th in defense, 4th in offense. So, the Hornets have been a force to be reckoned with recently. And, I think they're a lot better than their record. They've just completely been a different team. And, they've got LaMelo running the show. We know that he is a little feast or famine, hit or miss. He makes some absolute boneheaded plays, but then will win the game for you down the stretch with some spectacular plays as well. I have maintained my position as a LaMelo believer and a fan of LaMelo. Even when his stock was low, I stuck onto that stock just because I think he's very uniquely special as a playmaker and a passer. Not only just like the flashiness, but he genuinely is like a pass first guy, even though he kind of has the personality of a shot chucker. Like he does defer and look to set his guys up more than most players in the league do. And in a lot of ways, he is more of a prototypical point guard, which is sort of a dying breed. But he's also so talented. He has ridiculous range, can make super difficult shots. I think he's at his best getting downhill to the basket. I think he should do that a little bit more, but he does tend to get kind of jump shot happy. So I think that's the main knock on him in general and some of the decision making. But again, sometimes the decision making is great. So it's very confusing. There's plenty of guys across the league that are bad decision makers, but they're just normally always bad. He can be phenomenal at times. So it makes it a little confusing. But Concanipple is about as good as anyone could have possibly expected coming straight out. I mean, his numbers are in line with like prime Klay Thompson. Led the NBA in 3-pointers made this season. He's been ridiculous. Very much struggled in the playing game. He got benched down the stretch, so that is something to monitor for sure, especially if they end up winning the play-in game, just because, I think a lot of people thought he would be a playoff guy, but he is 0 for 1 in terms of having an impact in these high leverage games. So we'll see, but I'm a huge Con fan, big Con believer. I think he'll be fine. I think it was just a bad shooting night for him. So we'll see. And then Brandon Miller made a pretty sizable leap for them this season as well. Just a lot more consistent, a lot more efficient, a lot more reliable as a creator, as a shooter. He also just was healthier. That was another thing for LaMelo too. Like, those guys just played, and they haven't been playing over the past few years. And then Moussa Diabate, moving him into the starting lineup is really what coincided with this big run. And then Miles Bridges has just been rock solid for them. So the Hornets, I think, at least could make this interesting with Detroit. I definitely worry about their size or lack thereof, and the physicality that Detroit brings. I think they could get bullied, and that part of it worries me a little. Like, Diabate's undersized. Kalkbrenner, it seems like they don't totally trust him off the bench. I mean, he is a rookie, so it makes some sense there. So I think Charlotte is good enough to win a couple games in this series, but ultimately, if the Hornets win, I do have Pistons in 6 still, just because I think the physicality and the size and defense of Detroit is just going to be too much for the Hornets, who rely a little bit more on finesse. And I think could be a little bit of a rude awakening for a team that, um, hasn't been to the playoffs also. So I don't think it's a bad thing for them to get in and take their battle scars and then maybe make a big addition in the offseason and be ready and reloaded for next season to be not just sneaking into the playoffs, but maybe like a top 4 seed or something like that. And then if it's the Magic, I'm going to go Pistons in 5. I do think Orlando will win 1 game, but I would not be surprised if it was a sweep just because I don't know. I feel like this team's kind of quit on each other and themselves. So we'll see. Either way, Pistons advancing. I mentioned some of my worries with them, but again, I don't think any of that stuff's going to really come to fruition in round 1, just because I think that they're the better team. In Charlotte's team, the more experienced team, they're going to have the best player in the series, regardless of which team wins in the play-in. And so I think Detroit's going to take this one. Up next, we've got the Celtics against the 76ers, who beat the Magic earlier this week to win the 7th seed in the Eastern Conference. Another team I was very wrong about this year. My 3 biggest misses by far were Detroit, Orlando, and Boston. My preseason picks were pretty solid across the board otherwise, but those were huge misses for me. The Celtics, I thought were going to have the kind of year that Indiana had. Maybe not to that extent where they're like bottom 2 team in the league, but I thought it was going to be one of those where if they got off to a tough start, they might do the Jalen, how's that knee feeling? Derek White, how's that ankle doing? And start to kind of quietly tank and load up to try to get a high lottery pick. But they got off to a good enough start where they kind of had to keep going for it. And then they just really hit the ground running. And then they reached a point where they started to win at such a clip that they obviously had no choice but to continue to go for this. And they ended up winning 56 games. I mean, if you had told me that, I completely would not have believed you preseason, just given the attrition on this roster from last season and the turnover and, just losing Porzingis, losing Drew Holiday, losing Al Horford, not really adding a ton of guys outside of Anthony Simons, but then they trade him midseason for Vucevic, who also is he can do a little bit offensively, but he's pretty washed defensively and probably just more of a 15-minute a game guy at this point. And the other thing is, if you'd asked me if Tatum was going to play, I would have said no chance. I was very much in I would be very surprised if he ends up playing, but he looks pretty damn good, which is what's crazy about this whole thing. They're 15-5 since he's come back with a plus 9.2 net rating, but they were plus 8.1 on the season, which is 4th in the league. They're 2nd in offense, 4th in defense. And since Tatum's been back, their 5-man lineup of White, Pritchard, Brown, Tatum, and Kata. Small sample, only 102 possessions, but they are plus 53 net rating, 143 offensive rating, 90 defensive rating. So absolutely elite on both ends of the court. Again, small sample size. I'm not going to read too much into that. But this team, you have to give so much credit to Joe Mazzulla and what he's been able to do. They've really just been elite at creating advantages on the margins. They are the lowest turnover team in the NBA. They are a top 3 rebounding team, a top 5 offensive rebounding team. They're 4th in 3-pointer attempts, 3rd in 3-pointers made. So, they're winning all of those margin battles, which has allowed them to make mistakes at times and still have a sort of a cushion to be able to stay in these games and compete. Jaylen Brown has been the head of the snake in terms of this team and his elevation. He's probably going to make at least 2nd team All NBA. He's got a shot for 1st, but with Cade and Luka being eligible now, I'd probably bet against him getting 1st team because I'd put those 2 guys on with Wemby, Jokic, and SGA. But he's going to get votes for sure. And he's deserving of those votes. He really has been the guy. There's been sort of the discussion of whose team is this for a while. I think it reached a point where everyone was pretty positive it was Tatum's team, even though Brown did win Finals MVP and Conference Finals MVP. But, he's been the best player on the team. And I think for this season, at least, he's going to continue to be the best player just because Tatum has looked really good physically, but he has been inefficient. The shot hasn't quite fallen at the clip it's used to. He's still getting his footing a little bit. He's still a little less confident going to the basket than he has been years past, but still very effective. He's averaging 20 plus still. He's still probably the best rebounder on the team. He's one of the best passers on the team and decision makers. He's still getting his points. So, it will be kind of interesting to look like down the stretch of some of these really important games in the clutch, like who are they running plays for? Who's dribbling the ball at the top of the key and getting the sets run, and who's getting the call for the ISO, etc. I don't care too much into the like whose team is it, but I will be interested to see like the plays they historically ran for Tatum. Are they going to keep doing that, or are they going to change the playbook a little bit to prioritize Brown more? We shall see. Um, but the funny thing is, Jaylen Brown does have this very strange where the team is almost 6 points better when he's off the court compared to where he's on. So I don't really know what to make of that. I think that's not to say Jalen's a negative player or anything like that, because I don't think he is, but it's more of a compliment to the rest of the guys in Missoula and how they've been able to get the most out of a lot of these role players. Like Kada kind of came out of nowhere. Baylor Shireman looks like a legitimate rotation guy. Hugo Gonzalez, he's got the biggest net rating swing on the entire team, and he's been really, really good defensively, especially. Jordan Walsh, Luka Garza, Ron Harper Jr., these guys have had different stints of moments throughout the season. And so it really just comes down to the fact that Missoula has gotten the absolute most out of this team to this point. So with the Celtics, you got to feel pretty good if you're a Celtics fan, but I think there's a couple things to maybe be concerned about. I think one is, last year the live by the three, die by the three kind of killed them. In that Knicks series, they just kept shooting threes, and they weren't falling. And, that's how they lost game 1 and game 2. And the series was kind of over at that point. And you look at a lot of their core guys, and the shooting numbers are down across the board. Jaylen Brown's only 34.7%. Derek White, 32.7%, which is way down from where he's been in like the 38 to 39 range on high volume. Tatum, small sample, obviously, but only 32.9%. Pritchard is 37.7, so that's a solid number, but still kind of below where he's been. He's been a 40+% guy over the years. Hauser, 39%, again, still a solid number, but a little bit down from where he's been too. And then Vucevic is 34%. So if you look at the main core guys in the rotation, you've really only got 2 guys shooting above 35%, one of them being Hauser, who, he's probably not even going to really be in the closing lineup anyway. So that's one thing to consider. Another thing is kind of what I said earlier. Like, it feels like Missoula has kind of gotten the most out of this team. So the question is, like, do they have a level up? And we've seen, obviously, this team's won a championship with the general core they have, at least their top 3 guys. But, the other guys, do they have a level up? Does Pritchard have a level up? Does Kada, is he going to be as effective come postseason time? Some of the lesser guys, Shireman, Gonzalez, like, are they going to be as good of rotation guys as they were in the regular season? Vucevic, is he even going to be playable? Because I could see him being a guy that, isn't really tenable to have in the rotation in certain matchups. So we'll see. Again, I'm nitpicking. They've been really, really solid this year. And so when we look at the Sixers and playing against, like, it's another series that, unfortunately, I do feel like injuries is pretty majorly affecting. They are 24-14 when Embiid plays this year. They're only 21-23 when he doesn't. And I do think he could pose a real mismatch for Boston, because over the years against the Celtics, they've kind of owned him. But, Al Horford's kind of been the quote unquote Embiid stopper. He's not on the team anymore. Don't think Vucevic stands a chance against him. Kada, I don't know. I haven't seen enough sample size of those guys going at it, just with Embiid being in and out of the lineup, to know like how he would fare in that situation. But, I do think it's a more advantageous matchup for Embiid this year than it would be in years past, just because of some of the uncertainty at the center position for Boston. Again, Kate has been great as a rebounder, but I wouldn't say he's like some otherworldly defender or anything like that. And Embiid also has quite a bit of size on him, at least bulk. So it could have been a good matchup for him, as I mentioned. But without him, it's going to be really tough. They at least have Paul George back. I think he's underratedly very important for this team. Again, they're 22-15 when he plays, 23-22 when he doesn't. So, without it with Embiid or without Paul George, this is basically a 500 team. But when at least one of those guys plays, they're pretty, sizably above 500. And it's really going to come down to Maxey. I, unfortunately for the Sixers, think that their only chance in this series is for him to just kind of go berserk. We've seen him do it in years past. He was phenomenal against the Knicks a couple of years ago in the postseason. If he puts on that kind of performance, I could see them stealing a few games and this being competitive. But if they are able to successfully contain Maxey, which it should be a little easier without Embiid playing, obviously, then I think that it's going to be really, really tough for the Sixers just because I don't know where the offense is coming from. Paul George just is not the same guy that he used to be. Despite I still will defend that Paul George is a positive player and a really glorified role player, but they would need more out of him than just that. And I don't know how much of that he has left in the tank. And then after that, it's just going to be a lot of, Kelly Oubre and, Andre Drummond and Justin Edwards. VJ Edgecombe obviously could be an X factor for them. So if he is a guy that's, averaging 15, 20 plus points per game, then maybe that changes some stuff. But again, kind of a lot to ask for a rookie. I think VJ is going to be solid, but they're going to need like a legitimate, probably 20 to 25 points per game out of him if they want a chance in this series, just because I think just so much of the offensive load is going to fall on Maxey. And we saw last year when a lot of that load did fall on him, he was inefficient and inconsistent at times. So we will see. I think Boston should have a pretty easy time in this series just because, as I mentioned, like it's really going to take an absolute like otherworldly series for Maxey, which again, I think he's capable of, probably not likely enough to actually win the series, but I have Celtics in 5. Could see it going 6, but I'm going to go with 5, just assuming that Embiid does not play. Maybe he comes back game 4, game 5, or something like that, and they can win one extra one. But I think just coming back mid-series is just going to be tough for Russ purposes for a guy that hasn't exactly had the best postseason track record anyway. Okay, up next we have Knicks versus Hawks. And the Hawks have been one of the hottest teams in basketball. They started the year 27-31 and finished it 19-5. They were a plus 11.4 in net rating over that span, which was third in the NBA. On the season, 12th in net rating at plus 2.4. They obviously do not have Trae Young on the team anymore, but they've kind of got this a little bit of a hodgepodge of cast-offs, if you will, alongside Jalen Johnson. But it's been really effective for them, and they've been solid on both ends of the court. And then on the Knicks side of things, they're third in offensive rating, seventh in defensive rating, which is, surprisingly pretty high for them. They get quite a bit of flack for some of their defensive shortcomings, but, top 7 is a good number for this team, especially considering they've got Cat and Brunson on the roster and playing big minutes, and they were 5th in net rating. The Knicks earlier in the year did their classic January struggle. They did the same thing last year. It was actually NBA Cup hangover, which we've seen all 3 years now of the Cup, where they went 2-9 directly after the Cup. But again, they had a similar stretch last season and were able to turn around just fine. But since then, they've kind of just gone about their business. They're flying under the radar a little bit. They were 28-11 to finish the season. They were third in net rating over that span with a plus 10.4. Again, a really, really good number. They've quietly finished the year 12-4. So they've played really good basketball over the last, month or 2 months since those early struggles. And I actually think this Knicks team is, probably the best version of New York that we've seen over the last 3-4 years in sort of this era of Knicks basketball, because they've got another year under their belt with Cat and Bridges in the fold after they made the conference finals last season. They've got, in my opinion, the deepest bench they've had, since they made that trade at least. Mitchell Robinson had the healthiest year that he's had in a while. Miles McBride, I think he continues to improve year over year, and I really like the minutes that he has on both ends of the court as a shooter and then also defensively. Shamet, Clarkson, Alvarado, all flawed players, but they've got options at least there. In the past, they didn't have much, and they were kind of being forced to play guys like Campaign, for example. So I think Alvarado brings a little bit more of a defensive identity there. Clarkson, more shot creation. Shamet, more spot-up shooting and a little bit of two-way play. And then they've got guys like Diawara who have been decent in spot minutes. But I know that this is sort of a trendy upset pick. If you look at all the first round matchups, a lot of people are. I mean, I've seen people that are well respected in the media picking the Hawks, but also a lot of people saying that this is the series that could get more interesting than people think. And I kind of disagree. Would I be absolutely shocked if it went 6 games or even maybe 7? Like, I wouldn't be shocked, but a lot of that just has to do with the fact that I think New York likes to make this Knicks team likes to make things stressful. They typically take care of business more often than not, but they often do it in a way that is a little stressful for their fans and not the most straightforward. And so could I see them doing that? Of course. But ultimately, I think this Knicks team is way more talented than this Hawks team. And I think that they also are way more experienced than this Hawks team. So I think that the talent discrepancy is bigger than people are leading it on to be. I like the Hawks roster. Don't get me wrong. I like a lot of the pieces in the Hawks roster. Don't get me wrong. I think Jalen Johnson was worthy of second team All NBA this season. With the guys being eligible, he might fall to third, but to me, he's an absolute lock to make All NBA 23, 10, and 8. What he was able to do as a playmaker this season is so impressive for a guy of his size and especially at his age, too. He just continues to get better and better. He's a monster in transition, really good positional rebounder, etc. Like, I can't say enough good things about Jalen Johnson. But around him, it's kind of like a by committee. Nickeil Alexander-Walker would be my vote for most improved player. I do think he'll win that award. And he's just taken leaps and bounds from where he was as sort of just the stand in the quarter, spot up shooter, defensive specialist for Minnesota onto a much more expanded offensive role where he's actually upped his efficiency as well. He talked about just having the longer leash and being able to shoot through some early misses being huge for him this year. CJ McCollum was a little not great to start his tenure with the Hawks, but has turned things around. You've got Kuminga in the fold. Okongwu's had a really nice year. Corey Kispert, Mo Gay, like they've got guys up and down this rotation that I like, but it feels like one of those teams that, I don't know who their guy is going to be down the stretch in a postseason. In theory, you'd say Jalen Johnson, but he does a lot of his damage in transition, struggles a little bit more in the half court. I don't know. I'd say the weakest part of his game is generating and creating good looks for himself in the half court just because his shot is not great. And it can be a little clunky at times despite the talent there. And so I really worry that it's going to be a lot of CJ McCollum in those situations, or maybe even worse, a lot of Jonathan Kuminga. And look, if we're down the stretch in these games and it turns into Jalen Brunson versus CJ McCollum, I don't like those odds for the Hawks. And I know Dyson Daniels is a spectacular defender. I absolutely love him as a player, and he should be able to really wreak some havoc against Brunson. But Brunson's been pretty hard to stop. Even when they've had good defenders on him over the past couple of years in the postseason, he's going to get his, and he's one of the best at just getting his. And I think just with this talent discrepancy, I don't think that the Knicks need Brunson to play at some godly level to win this series. And I think the thing no one's talking about is that Cat should be able to dominate this series. Like, Okongwu is undersized at the center spot. They don't really have a true center after him that plays big minutes. Jock Landale will get in there occasionally. They sometimes do small ball with like Mo Gay, for example. But I think Towns is going to have a monster series. I just don't think Atlanta has the size. And then even if he doesn't, like, Mitchell Robinson has been a real playoff game changer in series in the past, particularly against smaller, less physical teams. Like, the Cavs just looked completely soft when they played years back, and Mitch Robinson just completely dominated them. Last year against Boston, I mean, they were intentionally fouling him to try to get him out the game, Mazzulla was, because of the impact he was having. And when you look at guys like Horford and Porzingis, who aren't really big interior presences and both a little compromised in that series anyway, like, Robinson is such an X factor, and I don't think they're going to be able to stop him from offensive rebounding. I think he's going to be a major deterrent and presence in the paint, especially for guys like Jalen Johnson trying to get there. And then I think Towns is going to be a huge mismatch on the offensive end of the court. So I think New York is going to win this, and not to discredit the Hawks, because I like the Hawks. I think they're a good team. I think they're probably the fifth best team in the East. And, I was high on them preseason. Of course, that was with Trae Young, but I still like the group they have. But that 19-5 run they went on, their 19 wins, is not exactly top tier competition. They beat the Nets 3 times. They beat the Wizards 2 times. They beat the Bucks 2 times with no Giannis. They beat the Mavs 2 times. They beat the Magic and their dysfunctional team 2 times. They beat the Grizzlies, the Kings, the Warriors, the Blazers, the Sixers, and then 3 good wins: Pistons, Celtics, Cavs. But only 3 of those 19 wins were against top 6 seeded teams. So it was a little bit of schedule help there. Of course, they did play well and they took care of business and they were dominating those teams. It wasn't like they were barely winning. But again, I think a lot of the doubt in the Knicks is kind of overblown, in my opinion. I think that they're just kind of the boring team. We know what we're getting out of them. But I actually kind of feel like they're a team that has a level to go up. And I think a lot of the other top teams in the East, I don't know if that's the case. We saw the Knicks go level up last year. They looked overwhelmed against Boston in the regular season, and then looked like a totally different team come postseason time. And Indiana, if Halliburton doesn't hit that crazy shot in game 1, or things go differently in OT, then that might be a 7-game series with game 7 in New York. And who knows, maybe they're going to the finals. So they were really close last year. I just don't think this Atlanta team has enough offensive firepower or general talent across the board at the top of the roster. And I think I am just terrified that we're going to get a lot of CJ McCollum in clutch time. We're going to get a lot of half-court Jonathan Kuminga. We're going to get a lot of swing the ball to Dyson Daniels in the corner, dare his sub 20% three-point shot to go in. And yeah, I think it's going to be tough for them. So I'm going to take the Knicks in 5, actually. So I think Atlanta will get a game, but I think the Knicks they're just a better team across the board to me, and I trust them to take care of business. And then the last series we have is the Cavaliers against the Raptors. And the Cavs obviously had a big major shakeup during the regular season before the trade deadline, trading Darius Garland for James Harden. So it's pretty similar look team across the board, but they played a lot better after the Harden trade. They were 21-9 after that trade, 4th in offensive rating with a 120.7 over that span. Their defense definitely did slip a little bit. They fell to 18th over that period, but they were 9th in net rating on the season with plus 4.1, 6th overall in offense, 15th overall in defense. So again, the defense a little lower than where it's been over the past few seasons, but Jared Allen missed a good amount of time, so that could have been a factor as well. And then also some of their wings were injured for most of the year, like Max Strus, for example. But this Cavs team, the postseason has not exactly been kind to them over the past few years. They've lost as favorites in 2 out of the 3 years in the Donovan Mitchell era. They have yet to make it out of the second round. And they, most importantly, eye test wise, have not looked like the team that we have come to know in the regular season. In 2023, they averaged only 94 points per game in their first round series. In 2024, they averaged only 98 points per game across their first and second round series. So in total, those 2 years, 97 points per game. Their offense looked like a total shell of itself. Turned into a lot of Mitchell hero ball. Mobley was not contributing at the level that they need him to on that end. A lot of that had to do, Garland's been banged up, so that's obviously not something to consider anymore because he's not on the team. And Jared Allen has looked soft. And last year they absolutely dominated round 1 against Miami, but again, pretty undermanned Miami team. And then in round 2, they scored more than they had in the previous years, but again, they kind of got their asses kicked by Indiana, and they were big favorites in that series. Let's not rewrite history. Like, they were sizable favorites in that series. Indiana was legitimate underdogs. Cavs were a 64-win team that, most people picked to, at minimum, make the conference finals and face off against Boston, and neither of the teams ended up getting there. But how this team translates is still going to continue to be a question. I've kind of been in the frauds until proven otherwise camp over the years with the Cavaliers, and a lot of it has to do with the Mobley-Allen pairing, and does it make sense to have those two together? And, can at least one of them play or let alone elevate in the postseason, but play to their normal standard, which they just really haven't done, especially Jared Allen. And, Mobley's just left a lot to be desired. And really this whole season, to be honest. Like, I think I've also been maybe number one in the camp of let's pump the brakes on Mobley a little bit too, because the way people talk about this guy is sort of like a top 15 player in the league. And I just think he's too limited offensively to put him in that kind of class. I still think he's really good. He's a special defender and he can do a lot offensively as a complementary piece. But to me, that's really all he is at this point until he proves otherwise. And, I wouldn't say he regressed this season, but he kind of stagnated. He didn't get any like noticeably better after being all NBA last year. And then this year, a lot of open spots in all NBA with all the ineligible guys. And he still really isn't even close to the conversation this year. Didn't make the All-Star team either. So the question is, can those guys not only, perform better, but then also, is the Garland to Harden pivot, like what does that do for this team? Garland has been pretty much a non-factor in the postseason for them. He's been injured, he's missed games, and he just hasn't been his normal self. And so it just happened enough times where Cleveland was like, look, we got to get more certainty here, which a little bit ironic when you think about James Harden's postseason track record, but at least he's going to play. We know that for sure. And look, Harden can have some big games. He can have some stinkers, but I do think that this team is, pretty well positioned where he doesn't have all the teams he's been on over the last, really throughout his prime. He's been the lead guard. Chris Paul, maybe aside from that, where he was, the point guard most of the time, but, in LA, he had great players next to him, but they were wings and he was still the guy with the ball in his hands all the time. In Philadelphia, he's got an MVP on his team and Embiid, and Maxey, but Maxey hadn't really broken out yet to the extent he has now. So again, it was him with the ball in his hands, but it's the first time he's been on a team with a ball handler and guard that's better than him in Donovan Mitchell, just given the stages of Harden's career at this point. So maybe in that more complimentary role, he can, exercise some of his postseason demons. I'm not banking on it. I'll say that just because the sample size and track record is just way too big at this point to think that he can do that. But he has definitely had a positive effect on Jared Allen. This year, Allen's averaged 18 and 10 on 71% with Harden and only 14 and 8 on 62% without him. So hopefully maybe that can help some of Harden's game. But I also think it's going to take pressure off Mitchell. I do think over the years, Mitchell with Cleveland, part of the reason they've fallen short is that he's been kind of forced to just go into his classic Mitchell hero ball. ISO and a lot of like tunnel vision type stuff. But, with Garland either banged up or not playing, like he's kind of had to do it because he's not getting the support from everybody. But I do think with Harden here, like hopefully those guys can play off each other a little better to balance it out where Mitchell doesn't have to do that, but then Harden doesn't have to be the lead guard all the time. So we'll see. I say all that to say that I still think Cleveland has got a good chance to win this series. We've seen them win the first round the past 2 years. Both of those years, they were, I think on paper, the much better team. I do kind of agree in that case as well with the Raptors. Raptors had a nice season. They were 5th in defensive rating and 15th in offensive rating. They were 11th in net with a plus 2.9. But, they're fit. People question their fit going into the year, and, they alleviated a lot of those concerns over the year. But the thing with me with Toronto is I don't know how much their game's going to translate to the postseason. Defensively, sure, but offensively, I definitely have my concerns. If you just look at the guys, the top of their guys in their rotation, like Brandon Ingram's been a massive mixed bag come postseason time. In 2022 against the Suns, averaged 27, 6 and 6 on 48% from the field, 41% from three, and they were an 8 seed playing a 1 seed. That it was a really competitive series, and he was a big reason why. But then 2 years ago, against OKC in the first round, Ingram averaged 14 points on 35% from the field, 25% from three. So he was atrocious. Could have been some health stuff going on there. But the point is, we've seen him look great. We've seen him look bad. So I don't know exactly what I'm going to get out of him. And he's going to be really important for them because he's really been the go-to, go get me a bucket guy for this team. Even though Scotty Barnes, I would say, is the best player, he still is more of a hub and facilitator offensively, and he's elite defensively as well. Can run some offense, but he's not necessarily a first option. And I think Ingram's been that guy. So they're going to need him to play more like the version against Phoenix than the version against the Thunder. And then Scotty Barnes has only made the postseason once in his career, and it was ugly. Again, it was his rookie season, so it's a little unfair to judge too much. But 13 points per game on 43% shooting, 17% from three. Like, he's going to have to be respectable enough to make teams guard him out on the perimeter to be able to be the same effective player he's been throughout this season. Again, that was 4 years ago. So I think Scotty will play better than that. And he's just a better player now, but it's still just worth noting there is no real track record of him being like a positive player in the postseason. RJ Barrett, career 42%, 32% from three splits in the postseason. Manuel Quickly, career 33% from the field, 27% splits in the postseason. Jakob Poeltl has not played a playoff game this decade since 2019. And so, look, it's just a lot of guys that have either not performed in the playoffs, don't have a track record. We're not really sure what we're going to get. And then a lot of their role players also are young and kind of unproven. Colin Murray-Boyles, I'm a big fan of this dude. I think he's going to be a legitimate high-level starter, really, really good defensive player, has ball skills and playmaking ability on offense. But again, he's a rookie. And so it's a little tough to ask too much out of him. Mamu's been great for them this year, but again, hasn't had any sort of expanded role in a postseason team. Jamal Shed, inefficient player, but hard-nosed defender, can create shots, shoot a little bit. Been a good bench piece for them this season. Again, never been in a postseason setting. Jacoby Walters had a good year for them. Again, never been in a postseason series. So there's just a lot unknown with the Raptors, and I think some of the preseason concerns I had about them in terms of the offense and especially in the half court and what that looks like, I'm going to continue to have those just because in the postseason setting, things get a little more magnified in your flaws. And so I think some of that stuff could come to fruition. So ultimately, even though the Cavs have not given me real reason to trust them, I just think this is a big talent discrepancy matchup here and an experience discrepancy matchup, which is similar to the Knicks. So I have the Cavs winning in 6 just because I'm a little worried still about how things translate. So I'm going to give the Raptors a couple games here, but ultimately I do think Cleveland is going to take care of business here. And I think it's more likely to go 5 than it is to go 7. So I'll take Cleveland winning in 6 games. Okay. So those are my first round picks. Now I'm going to walk through just my predictions for the rest of the postseason. Again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these. Just going to do kind of rapid fire, and then we'll go through round by round as the postseason goes on. But in the second round, got Cavs and Pistons. I know I just kind of spoke quite negatively about the Cavs in general, but I also kind of had my concerns about the Pistons. So I'm going to pick Cleveland over Detroit in 6 games in this series just because of the lack of support that Cade has. I think that this is going to be one of those postseasons where Detroit says, okay, we know what our flaws are and we got to go add around Cade now, because I just, from an offensive creation standpoint, I don't know where it's going to come from outside of Cade. And it's a lot to ask out of a guy that's been kind of inefficient and turnover prone throughout his career. Cleveland, I do think Harden being there is going to provide, ironically enough, a little bit more reliability than Garland. And I kind of feel like if they're ever going to get over the hump, it has to be this year. So we'll see. I have them beating Detroit just because of the lack of experience and the lack of support for Cade. I have the Knicks over the Celtics in the other series in the second round in the East, which that's becoming unpopular. I think a lot of people are on the Celtics right now. I just think with Tatum coming into the fold when he did, and I kind of feel like the Celtics are one of those, like, do they have a level up? They kind of maximize their roster. We've seen teams like that struggle when they get to the postseason, where I think the Knicks do have a level up. Also, I'm not going to pretend that the Knicks didn't kind of beat the Celtics pretty handily in the postseason last year. I'd argue this Knicks team is better. They've got more experience. They've got another year together, more playoff battle scars. Whereas the Celtics, I think this is a slightly less talented roster than what they had last year. I know people will try to tell you otherwise, but let's not revise history. The Celtics were overwhelming favorites in the East last season. They won 60-plus games again. They were the favorites for most of the season over the Thunder last year, even with how dominant they were. So again, I just think this is a less talented Celtics team with a probably slightly compromised Tatum, with guys that are having slightly down shooting years that I don't know if a lot of the role guys are for sure going to translate versus the Knicks. I kind of know what I'm getting. Again, they're the boring pick, but they've just been solidly consistent all year. And I think come postseason time, they're going to elevate a little bit. In the West, in the second round, I've got Thunder over Rockets. I've got them winning in 4. Uh, I think it's gonna be a clean sweep. I just think all the things I called out for the Rockets. I don't trust their half court scoring. I don't trust a Kevin Durant centric team to be dynamic offensively at this point in his career. The guard play is going to be an issue against OKC with all their guys that they can throw on the ball handlers and whatnot. Unless Reed Shepherd has a career series, but I feel like he's looked overmatched a little bit against some of the more physical teams like OKC. So I think Thunder will sweep them. Then Spurs Nuggets. I've got Nuggets over Spurs in 7. Again, the Spurs guards, they're inexperienced. I don't know how much I trust them as shooters. I think they're going to get left open. Fox has been solid, but also a little bit like where does he fit in with this team? I don't know if his role is super clear, and the inexperience thing matters to me. I've talked about this in years past when I picked Dallas over OKC a couple years ago when they were the 1 seed, just saying like to go from completely out of the playoffs to ascending into contention, most of those teams fall short their first year just because they got to take those battle scars. And so I think the Spurs will get those this year, and next year, I think it'll be a whole different conversation for them. But the Nuggets are really good too. This is my preseason pick to win the NBA championship. So they've won 12 games in a row. I think their middling streak during the middle part of the year was, a lot of external factors with injuries and whatnot. So I think this fully strength Denver team can win the whole thing. And so I trust them more. I'm going to take Jokic, who I think is still the best player in the world, over San Antonio in 7. Then Eastern Conference Finals. I've got Knicks over Cavs. If you haven't been able to tell, I'm a little higher on the Knicks than most. I think this is where we're going to start to see the postseason Cavs that we've come to know. I've got Knicks in 5. I think this could be a quick series just because of the physical nature of the Knicks and the size, and that stuff has bothered Cleveland in the postseason in the past. It feels fitting we would have some sort of Harden unraveling once he's in the conference finals. And I just feel like this year makes sense as being the year that the Knicks finally get over the hump and make the finals. Western Conference Finals. This was by far the hardest decision for me because I think the Nuggets and Thunder are the 2 best teams in the NBA. And I think it's, I know maybe the Nuggets haven't played like that, but I just think in a postseason setting, at full strength, full health, I trust this Nuggets team. They, since the bubble, have not lost a series with Jamal Murray healthy in less than 7 games, even though they've been overmatched in some of those series. Last year, I think a lot of people didn't think they had much chance against OKC, who was really dominant all year, and Denver, who looked really flawed and not very deep, and Murray was banged up and all these things. They still took them to 7 games and, had a chance to win that series. And so I think this definitely goes 7. I don't feel great about this, but I am going to pick the Nuggets over the Thunder. A couple reasons. One, I picked the Nuggets preseason, and it feels cowardice to pivot off that when I still think they have a good chance to potentially make the finals at this point in the season. I also think that it's really hard to make the finals back-to-back years, and I've been preaching parity over the past couple seasons and just saying, like last year, one of my preseason hot takes was the Celtics would lose in the second round. And I stupidly pivoted off that when I made my playoff picks. But the sentiment held where it's like, yeah, you can think that a team's a big favorite, but then things go wrong. Like J-Dub has had a weird year. He's been injured. When he's played, he hasn't been nearly as good as he's been in years past. Like last year, it was not a super easy road for OKC. And J-Dub played great. So if he plays slightly worse, do they lose that series to Denver potentially? Or, maybe health continues to be an issue for him. I know that they've been next man up mentality, but I don't know. I just think this is the best roster the Nuggets have had in the Jokic era. And it just feels like he's going to get a second one at some point. I know this is a really tough path for them, but trying to keep it series by series. So I'm going to take Nuggets over Thunder. And then in the finals, I've got Nuggets handling the Knicks pretty easily in 5 games. Like I said, I think Nuggets or Thunder. Winner of that series wins the whole thing, in my opinion. Again, still don't feel great about that. I think Thunder easily could win it. But the Nuggets, again, if they can get past OKC, I don't think they're going to lose to anybody in the East. I think a team in the West is going to win the title regardless. And so great story and run for the Knicks, but I don't know if they have the juice to beat anybody that's going to come out of the West. And again, I just think Jokic, like, it makes sense that he would win another one at some point soon. And so I think this could be the year that he finally gets back on top and we break the parity streak of a new champion every single season. And if he does this, obviously he will unanimously reclaim his place as the best player in the world if people don't think that anymore, which I still do, but I know some people are arguing SGA. So Nuggets over Knicks. That's my finals pick. Don't feel absolutely great about it because I do think the Thunder have a real chance. So if it ends up being Thunder Knicks, that very much would make sense to me. I feel pretty solid about the Knicks, but it's kind of a toss-up for the West teams. And that's going to do it for this episode of the Sean Jones NBA Show. Thank you so much for listening. Look, playoffs start on Saturday, so I'll probably record round by round. So as round 1 starts to wrap up and round 2 is starting, I'll do recaps and thoughts about the first round series and then predictions and previews for the second round, and we'll continue to do that throughout the postseason. So I'm going to try to pick up the cadence a little bit. I know I've been slacking a bit, just been busy with some other stuff in life, but want to definitely get back into this now that the postseason is picking up. And I'm super pumped to watch, so hope you guys are as well. But with that being said, thanks so much for listening, and I will chat with you soon.